to Psychosocial Wednesdays. Since we're now doing this once a month rather than every 2 weeks as we were through August, feel need for a little more of a reminder of what we're doing. More than a century ago, Freud gathered colleagues for Wednesday meetings that opened the world of psychoanalysis to a wide range of powerful ideas. Psychosocial Wednesdays are modeled on those Wednesdays and on Jung's meetings at the Psychological Club, and feature speakers from various psychoanalytic traditions, schools, and associated fields. Today, of course, we have a thoroughgoing Jungian, Joseph Cambray, who's going to speak on synchronicity, complexity, and the psychoid imagination. Joe Cambray, and actually, Joe, if you'll permit me, we were discussing when we were designing tonight whether we were supposed to use Joe or Joseph, so we basically used them alternately. President and CEO of the Pacifica Graduate Institute. He's also past president of the IAAP and has served as the U.S. editor for the Journal of Analytical Psychology. He's a Jungian analyst now in the Santa Barbara area. Envy at how beautiful that is. Many publications, especially the book on synchronicity through the Fay Lectures, and a number of edited volumes and many articles. So we're very, very pleased to welcome him. A few other notes about our upcoming events. In a week, we will have a book launch with Sonu Shamdasani on the Black Books, and in December, actually on the 9th, which is my birthday, we will see Nancy Krieger for the next of these psychosocial events. We have been arranging the 2021 calendar, about 2/3 of which is now robustly finished. Unfortunately, we're still battling with the rest of it, so give us some time to fix it up, and we will be publishing that fairly soon. So, Joe, welcome, and synchronicity, complexity, and the psychoid imagination, I'll hand it over to you.
So much, Paul, and welcome to everyone. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces as I see people coming in. There's the loneliness of being in this shelter in place is something that I think we're all facing in different ways, and the opportunities like this are so important to help form community. Of course, in the U.S., we've just gone through some, and we're still finishing our elections. And I raise that because I think some of what I'm going to talk about is about systemic thinking. And that's really for me at a deep level, what these elections were about, is whether we're going to take a systemic approach to the problems we're facing, or whether we're going to try to treat them in a kind of one-off reductive manner, which is what we, at least in the U.S. on some of these, have been doing. So I hope that even though I won't make this an overtly political kind of presentation, the thinking behind it does inform my views about politics. So what I'm going to do, this is a variant of some talks I've given. I'm going to use a PowerPoint and just gloss over parts of it because of our limited time. The notion of synchronicity was, of course, an extraordinarily fascinating and novel concept that Jung came upon, based in large part out of his personal experience and out of his clinical experience, about acausal connection, acausal in the sense of 19th century classical physics, quite honestly, and that something about coincidence, the way things were falling together in time, was crucial to that. And I'll give you a little bit more on the development in just a moment. For me, it was a matter of some of my own clinical experiences that brought this more to the fore to try to understand what Jung was really trying to talk about in this. And I think we are nowhere near the end of looking at the applications of synchronicity and the kind of cosmological mindset that's there. I would say this wasn't Jung's intent, but I would see it as a post-colonial text, because it subverts the old order of objective reality being at the top of the pyramid, and it opens up a door for subjectivity, something about the integrity of one's individual experience that offers that. But historically, where does the concept come from in Jung's opus? You know, where we know that he first talks about it in 1928 in one of the dream seminars. There's a whole, he's presenting some work on a dream, and there's a series of remarkable coincidences around that dream presentation. And finally, the students say, you know, what's going on, Dr. Jung? And he says, well, let me say that in the West, we normally think of cause and effect, but in the East, they have a kind of simultaneous falling into synchronous occurrence as a point of orientation. And the editors of the Dreams seminars point to that as the very first use of the term. And then a couple of years later, in 1930, when he's giving the memorial address for Richard Wilhelm, who's just died, he openly uses the term synchronicity for the first time publicly. But it really isn't until the late 40s that he actually comes out with the synchronistic hypothesis, together with the work he's been doing with Wolfgang Pauli. But I want to go for just very quick moment to the Red Book. And now the Black Books will illuminate this even further. I did get to hear a set of lectures that Sano gave on that. But this is fairly early on. Jung has had this encounter with his own imagination in terms of those terrifying waking visions he's had on the way to Schaffhausen. This is in late October of 1913. And what's extraordinary is his capacity to enter into those visions rather than try to seal them up. He felt himself being menaced by a psychosis. He thought he was, in quote, doing a schizophrenia as a possibility. And you see that very clearly in this very early on in Liber Primus in the first book, that the solar hero is being pursued, is in the drink, as it were, being pursued by this beetle character at sundown, and the sun is being attacked by a series of snakes. This beetle, the scarab beetle, not only is we're going to find it in Egyptian mythology as one of the first points of entry of the night sea journey of the sun and its renewal on a nightly basis, but as you'll recall from Jung's synchronicity hypothesis, it's the story, the paradigmatic clinical case for him was the catching the beetle and presenting it to the woman, and it was supposed to be the closest corollary to a scarab beetle that was in the Zurich area. So there was a lot of personal countertransference. Not time to go through all that, but you can see that when he told that story, it's about her rationality being broken through, but he's already got a long history with this beetle. And if we go ahead, the Red Book is got a chronological dimension to it. So when we get to page 55, we see this image of a solar bark with the Leviathan figure underneath. And what a difference. This is not about being in the drink with the monster being overwhelmed. You can see there's a kind of moving together with the energy and forces. The libidinal forces are really, in that sense, aligned with aligning with the direction that the self is moving. And so I think by this point, we see a lot of transformation that's underway in Jung. But as you'll recall, I don't have time to go through all of it, but August 1914 is really a very key moment in the Red Book story, because that's when World War I breaks out, August 1st, the Guns of August. And Jung then begins to acknowledge that he's on the horns of a dilemma. Am I a madman or am I a prophet? Neither of which is really something that he wants to embrace for very good reasons, I think. And I want to look at his exit from the Red Book, because I think this was the key dilemma he was suffering with and facing at that point. And it comes, as he himself says, when he received The Secret of the Golden Flower from Wilhelm, which was a Chinese alchemy, Taoist alchemy book that, gave for him a historical parallel to what he himself had been experiencing in his Red Book work. And what shocked him in particular was the coincidence between the mandala he was working on at that time, that exact moment, page 163 of the Red Book, and the Vajra mandala that was the frontispiece to the manuscript that Wilhelm sent. And he was particularly struck by the color resonance. But I think more deeply what we're looking at here is what his exit was. Why does he say that with this, he now has an exit? Well, we know he's got a historical parallel. I also think he's got a way out of that psychosis, madman prophecy dilemma. That, in other words, his, in quote, prophetic experiences about the First World War are not personal. They are something about the fundamental nature of reality. They are the structure of reality. And the synchronicity is not a personal prophetic ability. Rather, it's a cosmological principle that when the mind is open to, it tunes into, and you can begin to experience that. And I think that's really very key. What I want to go to in the synchronicity essay, he talks about space and time being basically reduced as almost zero, where causality disappears. And well, if this is written in the late 40s, this is exactly the time in history that the Big Bang hypothesis is being articulated. That is, Jung is making a very bold move here. He is going back to the scientific cosmogony of the culture that we're all in now in this modern culture with our Big Bang fantasy of the universe. And he's saying, you're missing something. There's another piece here. And that pattern formation, what he called, could also be framed as the Tao, comes in as a part of that narrative. So this is that classic model from, in contemporary physics, Big Bang, a singularity out from which everything flows. But let me show you another diagram just very quickly. If you start at the top, this is the singularity here, the originary explosion here at 10 to the minus 43rd of a second. There's no separation of any forces. You're going to a place where there are no physical forces being defined. They have not yet separated. It takes an incredibly short period of time for gravity to separate out, and then a little bit later the nuclear forces separate out, and on you go, you get the differentiation, so that by this point, at 10 to the minus fourth of a second, you're now looking at a universe that has these distinct forces that we all know from contemporary physics. But Jung's argument is here, no, let's back it up. Synchronicity somehow is in part of this part of the story. And that's extraordinary. And that goes with the kind of modern contemporary views of cosmology that says you must have had some various kinds of folds or bends in the explosion, that you had local asymmetries. Otherwise, everything would have annihilated itself. The matter and antimatter in a completely random moment would have led to a zero universe. There wouldn't have been anything. So there was some kind of inherent pattern formation. Now that can be extended on to the origins of galaxies and planets, and to life itself, and to mind. So the move that's made here to put this as an originary pattern forming fantasy is extraordinary. It is an enormously revolutionary move that is yet to be articulated fully. So what about the way into this through complexity? Again, my own experiences as a clinician with some rather stunning synchronistic events, I've written about these, so I won't go through them for time purposes today, I began to look at how do we understand this? And when I read through Jung's essay on synchronicity, it's very clear he makes some arguments about energy, where he's saying, this can't be a phenomena that has anything to do with causality, because there isn't an energy pathway for that. Well, the argument's really about closed systems near equilibrium. They're not about open systems far from equilibrium, which are what human beings are. Now, the physics of that it's still being worked out. So this is not to slight Jung, but just saying the model he was using of causality is one that would be a bit now out of date. So one way to look at the increase in complexity, you can think about this as a historical line of the development of science. You start with very simple things that you can explain, two particles interacting. You can write down full mathematical descriptions of that. You get a third particle in and you already have to fudge a little bit. It starts getting more complicated. Complicated is still reductive, though. Well, if something's complicated, we can still explain it as a sum of its parts. So I'm wearing a watch, just a standard watch, and it's got about 2,000 gears in it. And once you understand the mechanics of gears, you can explain what's happening with a watch. You don't need anything beyond that. When you cross the line from the complicated into the complex, that's no longer true. You're now into the world of holistic systems. That is, you cannot reduce the phenomena to a summation of the parts. And so living systems are the most obvious example. But let me give you a couple to ground this as we go through this. Here's a way of saying when you have agents, and those could be people, they can be molecules, they can be galaxies, it doesn't matter. When they start to interact in a competitive environment, there is a possibility for self-organization, spontaneous self-organization, and forming a new holistic pattern. It's called emergence. That pattern then has its own influence back on the interaction of the agents, and so you've got a circulatio going on here, if you think about that in terms of the interaction between emergent forms and the agents. So with that theoretical frame, let's give a couple of examples. Hurricanes, and this spiral form, it's an archetypal form. It's also a very straightforward form of emergence. Another one I like is water. Why is it liquid at room temperature? Well, from a scientific perspective, if you only knew about a water molecule, you'd think it would have to be a gas, because other molecules like H2S, hydrogen sulfide, are a gas at room temperature, and water's a sort of lower weight. It's not as heavy. So you'd expect, well, it would be a gas as well. But the truth of the matter is it's the interactions between the molecules rather than the individual. So you can't find the answer in the individual. You have to find it in the dynamic interaction. That's what complexity is all about. But when there's dynamic interactions, new things happen that are unpredictable from other perspectives. Here's a static example. Each one of those shells is unique. It's different. There's a genetic component to forming patterns, but the way it forms in its specific context will be an emergent pattern. And it will be non-reproducible. You can't predict what exactly that pattern is going to look from one shell to the next. Let's go through a much more epiphenomena thing. Here's a bridge that ants in the Amazon are forming. The bridge is not part, there's no internal image. And so this gets into archetypal theory questions about where is the bridge coming from? Well, it's an emergent form that comes out of the interactions of the way they use their bodies to achieve a particular goal in their environment. The bridge is the emergent form. And once it serves its purpose, it dissolves. So emergent forms are neither permanent nor temporary. It depends on context. They're neither good nor bad in terms of a moral reading of those. You have to engage at a human level with what's happening for morality to be part of the issue. I won't go through this. It's more the way that slime molds, they're kind of crazy creatures in all of this, the way they create a aggregate creature without any leadership, but it's part of their life cycle. Those of you who look at starlings know these patterns of murmuration where you get this fractal-like kind of creation of images, which is part of their adaptation in terms of where they're going to roost for a night and stay safe from predators. This is one of my starting points for all of this when I began to look at this. This is from the Mojave Desert in the United States. It's about a little beetle. We're back to beetles and insects again. It's curious how they keep recurring. On your left all the way is a very tiny twig, and those are juvenile beetle larvae. They spontaneously clump together at certain points. They must give off a correct kind of pheromone, a chemical signal, because male bees try to mate with this. They mistake it for a female bee. And you can begin to hear this mythically as I tell the story. As the male bee tries to mate with this, it's unsuccessful, but a number of the beetles transfer on. They grab onto the hairs of the bee, and they are then carried away by the bee to an actual mating event, which you're going to see on your far right, that when the male bee mates with a female bee, they transfer, the beetle larvae transfer onto her. They're carried by her then back to the nest, or to the hive, I should say, where they eat pollen. And they actually have to do that to complete their life cycle. They will not become adults. They will not individuate on their species level without that night sea journey carried by this very large being to this other realm of the land of milk and honey. I mean, this is scientific myth, but it's also observable fact. But I want you to see this is a complex system. This being, there's no internal pattern. These insect larvae have a notochord. There's a small central nervous cord, and they have a few, tactile and chemical signals to engage with one another. There's no leader that assembles them. This is spontaneous self-organization. That's an emergent form. Now think about this in terms of synchronicity. That part of what you're looking at is the way in which interactions happen, fields are created, and events occur that are outside of the awareness of any one individual, but they have a profound effect on the development of that individual. You begin to, I think, see the parallels here that one can make in terms of the use of complexity for applications towards synchronicity. The work of the people at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico, that was a group of Nobel laureates who got together and put out a whole model of saying, we're expert in our own areas, but we're siloed. And actually the most interesting problems are what's in between, which is neither physics nor chemistry nor medicine or this nor that. And they began to look at these areas that were too complex to capture before, and they began to model those. And this is where complexity science comes to birth. And part of their finding is that complexity systems have emergent properties at the edge of order and chaos. Well, that's an awful lot like, the edge of conscious and unconscious. And the example that I've used is a clinical one where I had a patient that I contacted during a holiday I was on, and she had a dream that she was very frightened about, that I was in the Black Forest and she couldn't find me. I go out that day on a diving trip, and the site is called the Black Forest, my very first dive. And so a lot of consternation, at least initially. Go on the dive, find that it's an exquisite experience. It's a black coral at about 60 feet underwater. It's a transformative experience for me. And I come up on board and realize we're both in a black forest from very different vertices. And that's like a complex form like that bee. That little bee model here. It's something like that, being in something together, but from very different parts of it. So you can find pieces in Jung like this one here in volume 13, where he says, it's not in terms of solving things, it's a matter of outgrowing when you get into self-regulating system. You have to go to a higher level. We'll put the word emergent in there. And that's what transformation is all about. So being at the edge of chaos and order. And if you want to talk about that in the questions, I can explain clinically how that worked with the patient of mine. She got more ordered through our interaction. I got more disordered. So I'll skip over Jung's models of this about the psychoid. There's some relevance, of course, to the contemporary world about the psychoid. Viruses, by the way, are very much in the psychoid world. On one hand, they can be crystallized. That is, you can actually crystallize them like a chemical, put them on a shelf, leave them there 10 years without any energy input or output, and bring them back out, and they are every bit, they come back to life immediately, and they are very infectious. So they're not quite living, they're not quite not living. They're really on that edge. And it's this psychoid quality to the virus that I think is extremely valuable and interesting. And if you read Jung on synchronicity, he says it's a psychoid phenomena, that something is activated at a psychoid level. So we've got a worldwide pandemic. And I can give you some examples, and I'd like to hear some of yours, about coronavirus-related synchronistic events. I think there are a lot of them going on right now, and that we don't always recognize them because sometimes it's happening at multiple places in the world simultaneously that are not necessarily speaking to them. I'll skip over these. These are some examples from nature of these kinds of things about rhizomatic forms. What I want to do in the little tiny time left is to go that's some more cosmology. By the way, you look at that picture, it's of the cosmic web. It's the largest scale pictures of the universe we have. The strings are galaxies, and they're strings of galaxies held in part in their form through dark matter and separated by dark energy. And you get this rhizomatic shape that within 3 days, this was published. A comparison of a slide of a mouse brain and its neurological connections and the cosmology's greatest image of the cosmic web. And you see the morphology, that the way this is the same at multiple levels. It says something about the universe we're in. I don't want to be reductive and say, aha, the universe is like a big brain. I think that's a little bit too concrete and reductive in and of itself. But there's something tremendously important about this archetypal form that keeps recurring throughout nature. And so what I want to go to in the very last moments is to talk about the history. This is the psychoid imagination. So I've mentioned a little bit about it. Are there evidences? It was always presented to me as if the psychoid is at the two ends of the spectrum. It's either into the infrared in the body so deep that we can't bring it to consciousness, or it's so far into the spiritual that we don't really have complete access to it, at least as a conscious being. So one of the things that occurred to me, this starts in about 2007, there was an article in the New York Times about these shrines in Isfahan, Iran, looking at this remarkable tiling pattern that was done. This one was done in about the 15th century, but it's starting in about the 13th century in Islamic tiling. These remarkable patterns start to show up. And when analyzed by contemporary mathematicians, they are shown to have what's called Penrose tiling. That is, well, they look similar. You can't slide them around over. They are similar in shape, but not identical, and they do not repeat themselves all the way until infinity. So then the question becomes, how in heaven's name did these 13th to 15th century tileists with protractors and rulers basically construct this level of complexity of imagery? Their imaginations were getting into the fundamental nature of reality. I don't think this was just pretty patterns. I think they were exploring something through their own imagination and their own techniques that was about the fundamental nature of reality. So it gets us into this place where we're looking at our subjectivity and our objectivity, and the way in which, when taken deeply enough, both lead us to similar kind of models. Again, I'll have to skip over a lot of this, but there was some recent work showing that Jackson Pollock was basically discovering fractals in his drip paintings well before Benoît Mandelbrot articulated these in the 1960s and so forth. This is back in the 40s. And what you see here is, if you look at a flat plane in terms of the filling the plane with forms, here's early Pollock, here's a later Pollock, and how it's edging towards nature. And then what Taylor did, he's at the University of Oregon, he actually looks at that Pollock's work from 44 to 54 and shows that he's experimenting with the density, the fractal density of a plane, and that his aesthetics is about where he really ends up. And it's kind of an optimal place. It's about what would be called 1.7 fractal density, how you fill the plane. And that is at a human aesthetic optimum. That his own aesthetic abilities were to fill those drip paintings just perfectly. The remarkable piece here is that somebody claimed to have discovered a Pollock, an early Pollock, and a drip painting, and the museum was about to buy it, and they brought in Taylor. And Taylor looked at it and analyzed it and said, no, it's too early. It's way down here. It couldn't be. Pollock had not yet found this. And sure enough, it was proved to be a fake. It was a very elaborate, clever forgery. But understanding his time development, it really fit this. And so the final one I'll comment on is Vincent Van Gogh. There's a lot of press on this. It's come out recently. If you stand in front of the originals, you can't see it here, but if you stand in front of one of these originals, from the moments in Van Gogh's life when he was himself very turbulent, again, people are very cautious not to be too reductive in this, but in paintings like The Starry Night, where he was in a very agitated state, he captures turbulence in a way that the paintings twinkle. They actually, when you get in front of them, he's captured turbulence on the canvas. And the physicists who study turbulence, who are still trying to work out the mathematics of it, are sort of astonished because they don't quite know how to reproduce this yet. I mean, they can create the conditions in the laboratory, but they don't know how to explain it. And again, what I'm trying to get at here, and where I'll end the talk for today, is that you see this kind of profound subjective artistic intuition entering into an experience of nature and reality and capturing it in a way that reveals a profound truth about nature. I've been interested in Huayan Buddhism, that Keigon in Japan, and it has a model of a universe with sunyata in it that looks very much like that cosmic web. That's through meditation in the 8th century AD. I mean, again, you can find example after example after example where the human capacity to go beyond what we should be able to see and enter into a deep, profound experience in engaging with nature is just opening up. So with that, I'll thank you for listening to the marathon presentation, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was lovely. A little disorienting, I must say. Somebody who's been sort of living and working with viruses as many decades as me, when you say viruses are psychoid, I'm like, whoa. So, no, I'm fine. A first question comes from Bernhard. Most of the questions so far are fairly dense, so we will see how many we get through. Gigerich, in his essay on synchronicity in 2012, wrote that meaning in this context has absolutely nothing to do with meaning with a capital M, whereas Jung himself said synchronicity assumes an a priori meaning, or some absolute transcendental knowledge. Do you have any take on that?
Yeah, I remember those debates in the JAP. And I'm not sure that it's a question of translation from the German, so I'm not the best person to capture the fullness of the argument. But I think if you're looking at what I would now call pattern recognition as the origin of meaning, the source of meaning, then yes, I think that's absolutely, it's fundamental. That's what Jung was actually pointing to. I think that's part of what we have to do, is unpack Jung's meaning of meaning. And I don't think it means just a cognitive understanding. I think he's talking about the way the subjective is a part of the nature of reality. That's where meaning becomes meaningful. In a way, if you don't have subjectivity, then meaning doesn't, it's kind of an empty concept. But if subjectivity is part of the very, very fundamental nature of the universe, then this is what. That's as close as I can get.
Okay. This is rather trivial, but I was just also thinking that.
Can I jump in
yeah,
to your answer, Joe? If you think about consciousness, then consciousness itself, or the emergence of consciousness itself, has some transcendental meaning. And you
Yes,
could argue that synchronicities or synchronicity is because it breaks the symmetry between the inner, the outer, between the conscious and the unconscious, between the subject and the object, that this is a pointer to some capital M meaning.
Yeah, I think the recent interest in altered states of consciousness is reopening this. I think what you're saying is profoundly important in terms of, that's why I want to be careful about not reducing the cosmic web to, it means a conscious universe or something like that. But I think consciousness, we don't understand it very well. And there's something about consciousness that we need a much deeper dive into, that we're on the forefront of this. Most recently, I presented a little bit of this in Vienna on the oracular traditions. There's a revisiting of the oracles, like at Delphi and so forth, by classicists now. They're finding things like, in fact, the dismissal of that kind of noetic was that, oh, well, this was just, sort of a fabrication by the priests and so forth. And part of that was there was no fault line there and there was no gas. Well, that was a myth that was true up through the early 2000s. And in about 2001, 2002, geologists went there and they actually, with more sophisticated equipment, found fault lines and found traces of ethylene gas and so forth. I mean, that in fact, there was what Plutarch is describing in terms of the altered states that the priestess enters into. There's very strong evidence of that. And so it opens up a whole thing, for me at least, on noetics. I'm not possibly using ethylene gas or anything like that, but just what's the range of consciousness and how little we actually understand about it. So I really appreciate, the far reach to your question. Thanks.
This is a absolute background concern, not really a question, but when I was reading your article, I do always think of one of the problems of wanting to instrumentalize these understandings. I know that you're cautioning us not to make certain epistemological mistakes, but maybe that's the Jordan Peterson problem, isn't it? Wanting to turn these into tools. So that may be just me. A question from Evia Wolfa Vestergaard. Actually, two questions, a warning. For Joe about patterns and emergence. What do you say about Jung's idea of archetypes as patterns? If we cannot predict weather patterns more than 5 days in advance, how can we accept any set descriptions of archetypal patterns, ego, self, anima, animus pur, senex, etc.? What is your... Oh, well, I think that's a separate question, so I will, by the way, admit that my current weather prediction app is giving about 10 days in advance, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's our human limitation. I mean, I think the fundamental principle about synchronicity, and again, I think this is why Jung is doing cosmology rather than just human psychology, and very deliberately, that, we're developing techniques that approximate the complex, but we really aren't there. I mean, I'd be the very first person to say what I'm talking about complexity is going to be superseded. This is not the end story here at all. That there's no mathematics that's completely there. It's a perturbation method. That is, you try to create a best guess, and then you watch what happens, and then you tweak your equations to come a little bit closer, and you kind of gradually circumambulate what might be the answer. That's how you get to some of these weather patterns. It's not the same thing as a total and full description. So I think that's the human limitation. We're trying to approach something and understand it within the limited capacities of our own cognition.
Sure. And it is somewhat embedded in our mathematical traditions. Even with the growth of the last 20 or 30 years, we still tend to have a determinate mathematics. So it's a little... Absolutely.
That's part of why I wanted to bring in those Islamic stylists, because they were doing a geometric understanding of reality that was, it took until the 1970s to model it with our mathematics. Now, I know there's some real value to the mathematics. I'm not in any way trying to minimize the huge achievements that are there, but I'm saying there is a kind of gnosis, a way of knowing that gets us to some of these things that we've not found ways to truly integrate into our theories yet. And I think this is a deeper it's more than decolonialization, it's de-Westernization of some of these. Well,
Of course. From Dennis Merritt. As a scientist, I've always had problems with archetypes as images of instincts. Archetypes of images of basic patterns makes more sense. That may be a comment rather than a question, but any response to that?
Yeah, I must admit I'm friends with George Hoganson, and on this one I'm pretty close to his view that what we were looking at, and you can find this in Jung when he goes further, I think, that the archetypal patterns don't reside in the cranium. They're not internal. They are about who we are in engagement with our environment, and that it's what's constellated is always an open system in the sense that you're engaged with that environment, both human and natural, and that what we call archetypal patterns are about the way those things unfold with certain kinds of stimuli. So that's a larger question for more than I can take on here.
Something from Nancy Krieger, who will, as I say, be our next speaker in December. Is one thing you are saying that one way of looking at a synchronistic event is emergent in a supraordinate system?
Yes, that was one of the starting places. Is all synchronistic events going to fit under that? I don't know. I can say yes. I can give examples that fit that model of superordinates. And by the way, one of Jung's forerunners, in that synchronicity essay, he talks about forerunners. One of them was Leibniz. And why is Leibniz important in this one? Because Leibniz is the person who first brings back the concept of superordinates. That the mind is superordinate on the body. I mean, he begins to articulate a mind-body relationship that uses a kind of an emergentist phenomena. I think actually Spinoza does better, but it's neither here nor there. You can ask why Jung didn't use Spinoza. Yet another question. But Leibniz is somebody he went to, and this was Leibniz's view. So there's some solid philosophical ground for that.
Idalina Souza, here's a sort of big question. I'm not sure where to go with this. Is a synchronistic event influenced or induced by intuition? I think what's implicit there is, can it be?
Well, that's another interactive question. Let me give the simplistic answer first, and then see if we can go from there. I would say intuition is according to Jung's typology, and I think it's right, it's a perceptual function. It's perception via the unconscious. So you're perceiving a pattern. And in that sense, the pattern is already there. But can we, in a world where quantum physics we now know is just how deep the understanding goes through that, can we ever put ourselves out of the equation? Because if you say, well, my intuition only picked it up, the pattern that was there, then you've got a non-quantum universe. You're doing a reduction back to classical mechanics to do that, because you're saying somehow your interaction isn't part of what happens to constellate things. So ultimately, I'd say that has to be.
Right, and I suppose the question also feeds back into that loop of how can the ego make this work for itself, which is endless and difficult. I don't know why this bothers me so much. Perhaps it's my nature, but Di Fernandez suggests perhaps a synchronistic event is an event where we cannot see the pattern yet, which I think fits into what you were just saying.
Yeah, when I was first studying complexity, one of the things that I did was think about Jung's methodology. Mm-hmm. I'll take a step away from synchronicity term. I got very interested in what was he trying to do with the amplification? What does it mean? And there are lots of ways to answer that question. This isn't the only answer, but in terms of what Guy is asking, one of the things it does is it acts like a stain. I'm thinking of histology of cells, and how do you see what's inside of a cell? Because it's invisible. You throw a dye on it and it helps bring out certain features of that cell. Well, I'm suggesting you've got a clinical interaction, you've got an interactive field where all kinds of things are popping and buzzing and whirling around. And when you use an amplification, you begin to create like a dye over that. You begin to see what is emerging in the moment. It gives you a way of beginning to identify those invisible guests who are in the room with you. And I think that was part of the way Jung was using amplification. You want to get a little feeling for that. Look at Michael Fordham's autobiography, and he talks about going to visit Jung. And he's really out to scold him because of the way his methodology works. And in this short vignette, he goes in there, Jung manages to coax him into telling him a dream, which Jung then amplifies for the remainder of the session. Fordham goes home and is just as rotten, and comes back the next day and says, you know what, you were spot on, but the people that are coming back to England are not all able to do what you're doing with this. And so there's this kind of recognition of the kind of genius way in which he was able to use amplification to, I think, catch what was emerging in the very act of emergence. I'm talking with Harold Ottmansbacher, who's knowledgeable about the physics side of this. One of his questions is, how do you get back closer to the uns mundus? What are the earliest forms of emergence? When do you pick that stuff up? Is that something our intuition can be trained to do?
Can I ask, to some extent, a cultural question? Being willing to entertain these discussions is typical of Jungians, and not a lot of other people, right? As someone who was interested in this for much of my life, but only trained fairly late, I always sort of am aware of being inside outside, and the fact that one of the reasons I would prefer to do this is it is possible to think these things. But of course there's desire there too, and there's attachment, and there's hope, and there, right? I've seen this in seminars I've done. What would you respond to that, sort of the culture of Jungians around this?
Well, I think Jung was a pioneer, and he really broke ground with all of this. I think part of what we're talking about is becoming more common in those who work in depth psychology. I'll refer you to Antonino Ferro, the psychoanalyst in Italy. You read his work, and it's just full of synchronistic events. I can cite 2 or 3 examples immediately. When I first started to work on this, I was in Boston, and a number of senior analysts in the Boston Psychoanalytic invited me in for a private discussion. And I started to talk about this stuff, and they got fascinated with the clinical side, and they immediately started sharing this. But we also revealed that their professional reputations at that time wouldn't allow them to speak like this. Mm-hmm. There's some work on that Lisby Mayer did on this in terms of papers that were Storrow's papers and so forth that were suppressed. One of the things that I like about the conversion, and maybe Nancy Krieger can also talk about this, one of the things I like about the conversion, reframing Jung's arguments from a perspective of complex systems, is when I talk about complex systems, I can go almost anywhere in the world and I can get into dialogue with people. Mm-hmm. That framing is now becoming a really important paradigm. So when I talk about this, for example, in China, there are people who that's what their doctoral degrees are on complex systems. And so I get a totally different kind of engagement when you do that. So what I'm doing, I'm playing a language game. In a way, shifting this into a language that allows us to speak across discipline. And I do that not just as a kind of personal convenience. I think complexity is the science of the 21st century. In as much as getting out of silos and speaking across. This is real diversity and equity that's underneath some of this. Now, I know there's a lot of socio-political dimensions to that need to be achieved, and we're talking about that at Pacifica right now. We've got a diversity, equity, inclusion task force on this, and I see this synchronistic piece as part of the fundamental thinking that needs to be opened up and allowed in.
Fantastic. I have to admit, for someone like me, it does suggest that, well, I don't know, it's worth living. We have a number of rather short questions, another hefty one from Bernhard. I am going to select, though, Andrew's question, Andrew Samuels. 2 people in an intimate relationship often say they experience a lot of synchronicities, so-called. Is this to do with synchronicity or with intimate relationships or both?
I mean, this is, again, I think going to be all your experiences in different ways. For me, synchronicity is about an unseen interconnectedness. That diagram of the analyst and analyst and the bottom line, the unconscious to unconscious communications. Well, when there's a deep emotional bond, that gets activated. Or when there's a problem about seeing it, can get activated. Clinically, that's what I was seeing. The Black Forest case, I wasn't paying enough attention to the patient's unconscious communications. And she was traumatized, and so she hadn't the cognitive wherewithal because of the trauma experiences that would shut down frontal lobe functioning when traumatic activations would occur. But boy, her psyche knew how to communicate with me through the unconscious like this. Especially once the synchronistic field got blown open, she would then dream of things like, and I never told her a thing, but she would dream of things like being in the water and floundering and drowning, and I would show up and do buddy breathing with her. That is, you take a breath off your regulator and you share it with your partner. A very intimate act in many ways, as you can really highly overdetermined. But to Andrew's point, the sense that synchronicity is part of what glues us. I mean, how many of you thought of somebody and then you get a phone call from them? You know, the sense of the field, I would talk about it like quantum fields. That there are these fields of interaction, and when people are emotionally attuned to one another, there's an activation in the field. And there are often synchronistic events around that. Falling in love is full of those kinds of things.
All right. Here's a rather fiercely formal question from Bernhard. In your book, you offer the conjecture that mirror neurons operate as field resonators, contributing to the neural apparatus that allows detection of the vicissitudes of the intersubjective. That's a good phrase. Analytic third, the intersubjective analytic third, let me clarify that, through empathic channels. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, empathy went out of fashion, you know. And the term's a very new term. Let me say just a little bit about empathy, because I'm going to say empathy has a synchronistic core to it. That it's about a resonance between us that isn't linked to all the kind of conscious things that we can try to. That's why I don't think CBT and that kind of stuff works. You have to enter in at a very deep level. The term sympathy is a very old term, Middle Ages at the latest. But empathy is a brand new term. It was coined in the 1870s by Robert Vischer, an art critic in the German-speaking lands. And he was trying to talk about the experience we have with an art object, that how we enter into an engagement with that art object. And he calls it a feeling at one with the object. What he would have said, Einfühlung would have been the term. Then Edward Titchener, in around 1910-11, translates as empathy. But if you look at Freud and Jung, they're using empathy, and Jung actually has statements about empathy being the transference. That's straight Jung. That's a quote out of Jung saying empathy is the transference. So he's telling you that it's, look, you're looking at a profound unconscious resonance going on between people that is part of this. And that my question with the neuroscience was a little bit cute. I mean, I was trying to say, you know, how do we have something? Because what mirror neurons are, they were a huge discovery in the 1990s. There was some work that was being done at the University of Pisa, I think it was. They were, this is Vittorio Gallese and colleagues. They were looking at motor neurons in a monkey's brain, you know, macaw monkey as it, you know, feeds itself. They were trying to look at action patterns in the brain. And somebody at lunch forgot to turn the machine off. And it starts clicking, making noise like those neurons are activated. And at first they thought that we were all kinds of mechanical failures and so forth. And finally they realized, no, there's a phenomena going on. And when they really looked at it, and it was because they could put sort of leads in it at the 4 or 5 neuron level, so it could be very precise. They realized that these neurons were firing because the monkey was watching the researchers eat. And these neurons then fire whether you perform an action or whether you observe or even hear the action. That is, they help create, they're at the very fundamental base of something like a theory of mind. That how do we know what the other is intending? That is, how do we empathically enter into their experience? Well, we have these things that help us recreate what that feels like inside of us. And that was part of the argument there. So if there are synchronistic fields, might these be something that would help activate our unconscious to enter into some kind of empathic understanding? Now, obviously, there are a lot of affective layers that have to be put atop of this. This is not meant to be a full description of empathy by any stretch of the imagination. And we know from Damasio's work that the affective empathy is much faster than cognitive empathy. So that by the time you're getting to somebody like Kohut talking about, a vicarious introspection, you're talking about a largely cognitive process, and that's not what we're talking about here with empathy. It's down much lower. It's a somatic experience that is about a profound resonance, and that resonance does have meaning.
It's interesting how many of these questions return to the same points, not because they're being maneuvered there, because that's their nature, right? That is just what they do. I know that you have another meeting. So is there anything else you would like to say before we let you go?
First off, I mean, a couple of things. One, I really appreciate the opportunity, and I do apologize for kind of speaking at kind of a manic state. But I don't know how to deliver this much information in a short period of time.
Completely
And
reasonable.
when I get going, it's meaningful. But the other thing I would say to you, and it's part of our experience here, every time I deliver this kind of material, and I deliver it fairly often venue, there's something different about the experience. And it is something about the way the field of interaction, literally it's the questions that come up, but more than that, it's the body language, it's whatever's going on. And quite honestly, I'm actually fascinated with what's happening to our psyches, that we're doing this fly's eye view of one another. We're all in our own interior spaces. You know, each one of us is seeing as a window into somebody else's reality here. We're not in the same room. We're not in the same time. The lights, it's almost 1 o'clock here. It's bright middle of the afternoon. It's nighttime where you're at. If we had sounds coming in, you'd hear the street noises that would be different. Our psyches were not evolved under these conditions. So I think that something of what's going on in this experience of Zoom, this is part of why it's fatiguing. We're getting way more information, but I think there are also a lot of curious other phenomena, unconscious phenomena that start happening around this, including breakdowns of equipment. So anyway, a wide open field. I think
Thank you so much. Beautiful presentation, not manic at all, lovely. And thank you for all of your attention and questions. Good luck with the rest of your day, and thank you so much. We'll be seeing Nancy Krieger in December, and Sonu Shamdasani will be doing not a regular event, but a launch in a week. So you're all welcome to all of that. So thank you, Joe, and we'll let you go. And goodbye, everyone, and tell us how things went online.
Many thanks to all of you. Bye.
It was very nice. Okay.